بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وبه نستعين ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم ثم الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وخاتم النبيين وسيد المرسلين أبي القاسم محمد وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين. Respected sisters and brothers in Islam and Iman, Salamun alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, we've gathered here for the purpose of remembering Allah, closer to Him. It's the month of Ramadan, and I hope that we can cherish every moment of this great opportunity that we have to participate in this divine banquet of blessings, which is the month of Ramadan. May Allah accept all your fasting and your other deeds that you are performing in this month. The topic that we've been discussing has been that of the revolution of the self. And as part of that, we explained how it's important for us to identify what things typically people are attached to by being part of this society that take them away from who they really are. If we want to really have a revolution of ourselves, we have to understand who we are. And we have to understand that by being part of this society, we're being pulled and pushed in different ways. Those things that we talked about, technology and media and movies and music and all these different things, we talked about them not just because they all start with the letter M, okay, but it's because they are important elements in our society that pull us in different ways, that dictate to us how we should be. Now today, or tonight, inshallah, I'd like to cover another one of those entities, something that is very prevalent in our society. And in order to introduce that, I would like to take you to the garden of traditions of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. In Nahj al-Balagha, which is a compilation of some of the sayings of Amir al-Mu'mineen Imam Ali alayhi salam, Imam Ali alayhi salam talks about what's going to happen to people as they get closer to the end of times. And he says there that يَأْتِي عَلَى النَّاسِ زَمَانٌ لَا يَبْقَى فِيهِمْ مِنَ الْقُرْآنِ إِلَّا رَسْمُهُ وَمِنَ الْإِسْلَامِ إِلَّا إِسْمُهُ. There will come a time when the only thing of the Quran that will remain for people is that its formality and its ceremony. It will be something that is read, something that people pay respect to. They have beautiful covered Qur'ans in their homes, and they make a show of paying importance to it, but it's just a show, it's just a ceremony. They won't actually act upon it. Now, before I go on, I just want to comment here that Imam isn't saying that everyone's going to be like that. He's saying that this is the dominant trend in the society. But of course, there always will be people who hold fast to the message of the Qur'an. And then he says, وَمِنَ الْإِسْلَامِ إِلَّا إِسْمُهُ, meaning that there'll be a lot of Muslims. But for many of those Muslims, it will just be a title, a tag. Yeah, I'm Muslim. Okay, so what does that mean? How does that differentiate you in your practice, in your action? There's nothing really there. It's just another name that people have. So this is what we have from Imam Ali in Nahj al-Balagha. And Nahj al-Balagha, as you know, is one of the authentic compilations of hadith that we have. Now, if we want to find out more about this, let's ask the question that what is going to be the quality of the practice that people have towards the end of times? We have other traditions from the Ahlul Bayt where they expand on this. These other traditions aren't found in the same type of authentic books of tradition as this first one. But because we have that first one and these seem to parallel from that, and they support that. That tells us that, okay, there's something here that we can at least consider to be potentially authentic. And also, when we look at the contents of these traditions, we see that there's a lot of it has come true or is going to come true. Let me read you another one of these traditions. This is from our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wa alihi. Remember the topic we've been discussing, which is that of false gods. This is what the Prophet says. He says, "Ya'ati ala nasi zamanun." There will come a time for people. Butunuhum alihatuhum. Their bellies, their stomachs will be their gods. Okay, now you can ask yourself, is that something that we're seeing right now? Think the Food Channel. Have you ever seen that Food Channel? It's amazing. Like I find it amazing that you can have even like more than one show a week on food, but they're able to have a whole TV station dedicated towards food. And if you ever watch that, it's amazing how they can take one thing which is just a small part of our lives, or it should be a small part of our lives, and they make it everything. They make it like our entire reason for existence. Anyways, one quality is butunuhum alihatuhum wa nisa'uhum qiblatuhum, and their women will be their qibla. The women of that time will be the object of worship, what people are aiming towards. وَدَنَانِيرُهُمْ دِينُهُمْ. Their money, their currency will be their religion. وَشَرَفُهُمْ مَتَاعُهُمْ. They will attain prestige and fame in the society on account of what they own and what they possess. Like who has the bigger beamer? لَا يَبْقَى مِنَ الْإِيمَانِ إِلَّا اسْمُهُ. There won't be anything left of iman and faith except for the name. People will call themselves mu'min, but it will just be a name, a title. وَمِنَ الْإِسْلَامِ إِلَّا رَسْمُهُ. And nothing will be left from Islam except for a formality and a ceremony. وَلَا مِنَ الْقُرْآنِ إِلَّا دَرْسُهُ. The Quran will just be studied, but it won't be acted upon. مَسَاجِدُهُمْ مَعَمُورًا. Their masajid will be built nicely. وَقُلُوبُهُمْ خَرَابٌ عَنِ الْهُدَى. But their hearts will be desolate and empty and barren from any type of guidance. Now, this tradition, it has a lot of parallel with the tradition from Imam Ali alayhi salam, and as you probably realize, there's a lot of these things we're seeing happening in our society today. And it's interesting how the Prophet is warning us against these. It really supports what we've been trying to say over the last few nights, that part of being able to have true iman and find our path to Allah is identifying what it is that we might currently be bowing to and be subject to other than God. Now, from this saying of the Prophet, there's one part that I want to focus on and take as the topic for tonight, and then inshallah tomorrow night as well, which is this part where he says, Nisa'uhum qiblatuhum. That at that time they will take their women to be their qibla. Brothers and sisters, we're living in a society where the concept of sexuality is something which is very prevalent. It's a society where the idea of people pursuing their lusts and doing what they want, being free in a sexual manner, is very much prevalent. And I'd like to, inshallah, tonight discuss a little bit about the Islamic perspective on sexuality. And don't worry, it will be tame. I won't be going past PG, inshallah. I want to discuss the Islamic concept of sexuality and then inshallah begin to discuss some of the sexual deviances from the Islamic perspective. And inshallah tomorrow night we'll begin discussing the topic of homosexuality and Islam's view on that. Because all of these are very important topics for us as believers to have a good understanding of, because we're being faced with them in ways that we never have before. So first of all, I'd like to explain a little bit about the history of sexuality in America, at least from the limited understanding that I have, not being a historian, but being somebody who is interested in this topic for the purposes of understanding the Islamic perspective on it. We are living at a time right now which is after the sexual revolution. The sexual revolution took place around roughly the 1960s was like the key and the high peak of that, although the roots of it started before that. And we need to understand how the situation came to be the way it is today. That you find that pretty much there's total sexual freedom. People are free to do whatever they want. There's very few boundaries and restrictions when it comes to when and how and with whom and in what sort of manner people will engage in sexual relations. There was a time in this society where the sexual relationships that used to take place were mostly between a husband and a wife. And at that time, people were typically more religious than they are today. And they believed in different forms of Christianity. Now, according to the classical understanding in Christianity of human being and the original sin, their notion, at least at that time, of sex and sexuality was one that was a negative perspective. They used to see it as being something which was a necessary evil in order to procreate, in order to to create the next generation. If people wanted to have children, then this is what they would engage in. But it was considered to be something which wasn't very good. And if somebody wanted to be pure, then they wouldn't be able to engage in it at all. And that's why the priests, at least in the Catholic tradition, they have to be celibate. They're not allowed to take any spouses. And they have to refrain from engaging in this type of low human animalistic behavior. We have to be above that. Now, this for people was not acceptable because we're created in a different way after all. We human beings have needs. We have the need to eat. We have the need for company. We have the need for breathing air. And we also have the need to engage in and have relationships with the opposite sex. And so what we saw was that in a mass level, the society rebelled against that. What happened in the 1960s is that the pill was invented. And what that meant was that now the barrier that was the natural barrier that was there previously, which would prevent too much promiscuity, that was lifted. Because now people were more free to exercise their lusts in whatever way they wanted to. And there was different factors. There was, social factors. There was like wars and, desire to like escape reality and the Industrial Revolution and the mixing of genders and a whole slew of different factors that led to basically the liberation of people's sexuality. It used to be the case that people would have to get married, and in that bond and in that relationships, that's where most of this would take place. It used to be the case that there was a standard for decency in television, in movies. At least, for the most part, there was some standards, but year by year, those are slipping. We're moving towards an era where basically there's no holds barred. People are free to do anything that they want. And even on a level of in the corporate world as well too, you see that people are allowed to exploit sexuality and sexual images in any way they want to do so. So this is the way we're moving, and basically it's going back to this notion of the human being being the center of everything. That I, as a human being, am allowed to decide everything that I want about what's good and what's not. If I want to engage in this relationship with that person, then if I think it's good, then it's good for me. There is no absolute standard. Whatever I think is good, that's what's good. And that's the way the society is turning to. Now, The reason why I'm saying this is because we have to understand this, brothers and sisters. Just because something is the way it is right now doesn't mean that it's right. It doesn't mean that we have to succumb. We have to just give in and say, okay, because that's the way it is, then we have to accept it as well. It's not the case that the majority is always right about anything. Like we as followers of the Ahlul Bayt, we should know this more than others, that the majority is not always right about something. If the majority right now is saying certain things about sexuality, that it's okay, you can choose whatever you want, and you don't have any right to tell us, and these types of things, we don't accept that. And we have to understand that this situation wasn't always there in the past. That's why I wanted to talk about the past and also the present right here. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Now, as I mentioned, what happened was that you had an incorrect perspective on sexuality, and you had people's natural creation, which was telling them that, wait a minute, this isn't right. This is not the only reason why God has created shahwa and lust within us. And people are also saying that, and they know that it's not something that which we should feel guilty about. And so they wanted to be liberated from that. But that's because they had the wrong notions about sexuality, and they were taught to them because they didn't have the right doctrine. Now, what we want to do before talking about some of the sexual deviancies is to, first of all, understand Islamic perspective on sexuality. Is sexuality and sex a bad thing? Is it bad if there's somebody who finds themselves having a desire towards the opposite gender? Okay, is that something which is wrong? Is it bad? Is sexuality something that's a necessary evil that's only supposed to be done solely for the purpose of if a couple wants to have children? And the answer is no. From the Islamic perspective, sexuality and sex is something which is positive. It's something which is a good thing. It's something which is a blessing of Allah. Allah has created that within us. And everything that He creates within us has a divine purpose. What we need to do is identify how we have to channel that thing within us. But had it been something which was inherently evil, inherently negative, then He wouldn't have put that in us. Let me give you some examples about the Islamic perspective on this. First of all, let me quote you a verse from the Quran. This is from Surah Ma'idah, verse 87. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, O you who believe, la tuharrimu tayyibati ma ahallallahu lakum. Do not prohibit that which Allah has made lawful for you. Those things which Allah has made lawful for you, in this verse He calls them as tayyibat, things which are pure, things which are good. Anything which is halal, which Allah has told us to go for and engage in, is something which is pure for us. It's not something which is negative that we have to think of as being lowly. No, do not prohibit it. But also, وَلَا تَعْتَدُوا إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُحِبُّ الْمُعْتَدِينَ. At the same time, know your limits as well. Know your limits and don't go beyond those limits, because Allah does not love those who go beyond the limits. So even when it comes to sexuality, even though it is a good thing, it also can be one of those things that can be taken outside of the limits as well, and one can transgress and go beyond that. We have to know what those boundaries are. One time a woman comes to Imam As-Sadiq alayhi salam, and she tells him that I am a woman who is mutabattilah. So the Imam alayhi salam, which means, it can mean different things, right? But here it means literally one who is cut off. So the Imam tells her, okay, well, by your definition, what does it mean to be somebody who is cut off? وَمَا التَّبَتُّلْ عِنْدَكِ. She says, لَا أَتَزَوَّجْ. I'm not going to ever get married. I want to, what she implies here is, I want to cut off myself from anything but God. I want to be pure. I want to be clean. And so I'm not going to get married, because in her mind, that's something which is lowly. the Imam alayhi salam asked her, he says that, she goes on to say, she says, he asked her why. She says that because by doing this, I want to attain proximity to God. I want to get spirituality. I want to get fadl. So the Imam tells her, go away from me. Insarifi. فَلَوْ كَانَ ذَلِكَ فَضْلًا لَكَانَتْ فَاطِمَةُ عَلَيْهَا السَّلَامُ أَحَقُّ بِهِ مِنْكِ. Because if that were something which was a merit, then Fatima alayha salam would be more deserving of that than you. Whereas, and no one, because Fatima got married, right? And he goes on to say, إِنَّهُ لَيْسَ أَحَدٌ يَسْبِقُهَا إِلَى الْفَضْلِ. No one can ever be higher than Fatima al-Zahra in attaining excellence and merit. So, Imam alayhi salam is trying to say that, look, we're your examples, we're your role models, we're human beings. And they got married and they engaged in sexual relationships as well too. But everything according to the boundaries that were defined within Islam. So it's not something which is negative. We have to get that out of our minds. Sometimes we might think that in order to, if we want to engage in these type of things, then we should still feel a little bit guilty. No. In hadith, we're told that these, when they're observed in the proper way and within the context of marriage, then actually it's an act of ibadah. It's an act of worship. And we're told in one tradition that it's as when one engages in the proper manner, in the halal manner, then the sins fall off of that person just like leaves fall off of a tree when the wind blows strongly. When one of the Imams ﷺ was asked, what is the highest pleasure that can be enjoyed in this world? He says that the highest pleasure that can be enjoyed in the material realm is the pleasure that's enjoyed within the marital context when engaging in those type of intimate relationships. So the Imam ﷺ is praising this thing. It's something which is good, something which is positive, but when it's done in the right context. So what we need to do is understand more about what that context is. Please say salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Now, there's some deviations when it comes to sexuality which are very clear to all of us as being Muslims. And we've heard about these since the time we started learning about the deen. But I thought it would be useful for us to review some of them and see how severe these are. Like, what is the sin about them? Because unfortunately, we're seeing that the tradition of the Prophet, where he says that people are taking their women as their qibla, basically that sexuality has become, the thing which drives people and is very prevalent. That's something that's afflicting us as Muslims as well too. These same things that we used to just think about as being problems faced by non-Muslims, we're facing them within the Muslim society as well too. So we need to remind ourselves about them for ourselves first and foremost, and then also so that we can educate others about them as well. So first of all, regarding zina. Zina means fornication. It means engaging in sexual relationships outside of the Islamic marital context. I was going through the many traditions that the Ahlul Bayt have mentioned and have been recorded regarding the severity of zina. And as I was going through them, I was astounded as to how big and how major of a sin it was. And there was so many of them, I can't read all of them. That's not the purpose that's not the purpose of our discussion here. But there were so many, I just had to pick one of the many which would indicate a little bit about the severity of the sin in the eyes of Allah and the eyes of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. In one tradition, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi, he says that there are three things which are the worst and the greatest sins that a human being could ever possibly commit in the eyes of Allah. What are those three things? Number one, he says that if somebody were to kill a prophet of Allah, he doesn't mention killing a human being. Killing a human being who is innocent itself is a great sin. But he's saying killing a prophet of Allah who is the best and the most purest of an individual, the perfect individual, and now somebody goes and kills a prophet. That's number one. Number two, the destruction of the Kaaba. If somebody were to go and destroy the Kaaba, that Allah has made a qibla for His servants. And number three is that if an individual were to commit fornication with a woman, and obviously who's not his wife. So it's on that level of severity in the eyes of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim wassalam. And we're told in another tradition that the human being who engages in fornication, meaning that they have relationships outside of the marital bond, that person will be punished the most severely in the hereafter. If somebody does that and doesn't do tawbah for it, of course. Now, that's zina, that's the actual act of sexual intercourse with the opposite relationship, with the opposite gender. Okay, now, what about other acts? Like, for example, let's say somebody says that, well, I'm not going to go all the way there. That, of course, we wouldn't go all the way there, although usually it does end up going all the way there. But they say, we're going to just, be boyfriend and girlfriend. What about that? In one tradition I came across, this is from the 5th and 6th Imam alayhim assalam, they say that if somebody were to look inappropriately at something which is haram, that itself would be the fornication of the eye. And if somebody were to kiss inappropriately somebody they were not supposed to, that would be the fornication of the mouth. And if somebody were to touch somebody inappropriately, that would be the fornication, the zina of the hands. Even whether or not the other type of fornication took place or not. You see, there's different stages, and every stage along the way towards any type of intimate relationship outside of marriage, that's something which is completely outside of the bounds of Islam. It's haram. And there's consequences attached to it as well too. And they're very severe. Look at the severity of zina and those punishments that we talked about. Now, they're talking about it at a lower level as well too. They're saying that's zina as well too. Let me give you another tradition. This is about another type of sexual deviancy, which is masturbation. In traditions, the term of masturbation, one of the ways that the Ahlul Bayt refer to it is they say that somebody who commits the act of masturbation, whether they be a man or a woman, that's somebody who is nakih of themselves. Nakih means to engage in the intimate relationship with themselves. So this was something that was around in those times as well. And what they meant by this wasn't just one way of doing so. Any way, whether it be through physical ways, whether it be through watching things, whether it be through going to certain places, all of these will be encompassed in this. What does Imam Sadiq have to say about this? He said that this is a very great sin that Allah has prohibited us from doing so. And the one who commits it, it's as if he has committed fornication with himself. This is the view of masturbation, and there's other traditions as well too regarding that. Now, this sin, like these type of sexual deviances, homosexuality, inshallah, we'll talk about, if Allah gives us tawfiq, we'll talk about it tomorrow night. These sins, they're not just ordinary sins, brothers and sisters. It's not just a thing that, okay, somebody does it and then, inshallah, they can do tawbah and they'll be forgiven if they happen to remember, and then they're okay. No, these category of sins have devastating consequences, dire consequences. You see, we know through experimentation in the physical universe that Allah has, whether you believe in God or not, we know that there is a system of cause and effect in this world. You know that water typically tends to boil at 100 degrees. You know that if you have, for example, I don't know, if you have a fire that's burning and you put water on it, typically that fire is going to go out. Right? That has to do with the physical universe, and these are laws that we all know and understand. There are laws that are placed in the spiritual universe as well that many times people are unaware of, even believers. But if they know about them, it will help them navigate their course in life much better. Let me give you an example. And this is just, I want to illustrate this point here. Usually people think about the way to get rich is to basically spend as much time as you can on your career. Right? You say that, okay, well, let me put aside everything else. I'm going to study really hard, and I'm going to work really hard, and basically forget about everything else. If I really want, the more number of hours I'm going to put in to run after this world, then the more I'm going to get from it. I'm not denying by the other side, I'm not saying that we shouldn't work hard. We need to work hard. We need to earn our risk, but we have to have a balance in our lives. Anyhow, people typically think that. But when we go to the wisdom of the Ahlul Bayt, we see that they tell us that in one hadith Qudsi, Allah talks to the dunya. And He tells it that serve the one who serves me and tire out the one who serves you. You see here, usually we would think that if you go and serve the dunya, then you're going to get it. But in this hadith Qudsi, Allah says that, no, the dunya, come and serve the one who serves me and tire out the one who serves you. So you see, we're learning something about the world that's different than what we might have thought. Let me give you another example. And by the way, these are not compiled. I haven't seen these compiled in any place, in any section of any book anywhere. And so it's your great fortune, inshallah, tonight to have the risk of receiving these. Let me give you another one. Whoever does riyah one day in this world, riyah is what? Riyah is when somebody shows off for some good action that they're doing. Whoever does riyah one day in this world, the consequence is that his reputation at one time will be destroyed. Right? So you think that, okay, if you show off, then people are going to think good of you. That's what we would think. But according to this tradition, we're told that, wait, you're actually thinking totally wrong. That the way to be beloved among the people isn't to show off, it's to conceal your good deeds. There's more of these, but the reason why I mentioned that is because it has to do with our discussion, which has to do with sexual deviancy. What we're told is that when it comes to sexual deviancies, we have to be very careful, because if we're not careful, the consequence is going to be that our own family members are going to be afflicted by the same thing that we deviate with. Let me give you an example. In one tradition, the Prophet is talking. Somebody comes to the Prophet and he's asking him about looking at things which are haram. And we're told, by the way, that when somebody looks at a non-mahram woman, like a guy were to look at a non-mahram woman, then as he's doing so, his eyes are filling with the fire of hell. Okay? Now, one time somebody comes to the Prophet and he asks him about this. The Prophet tells him that, would you like it if people were to look at your mother and your sister and your daughters? And the man says, of course not. So the Prophet tells him, then if you don't like that, then you don't look at other people either. See, this is one of those rules in the universe right here we have to be careful about. In another tradition, we're told that at the time of Nabi Musa alayhi salam, there was a man who was engaged in zina. And he discovered that, when he was secretly, supposedly trying to engage in this relationship, the same thing was happening at home. And so he was so taken aback when he found out about this. He goes to Nabi Musa and he asks, what's the deal here? Nabi Musa tells him that, don't you realize that if you yourself are not chaste, and if you yourself don't protect yourself, then your family is going to be at risk as well? See, the consequences are very severe. Another consequence is that we're told in tradition that somebody who looks at something which is haram and glances upon it and holds their gaze, then the result of that is that shaitan is going to fire a poisoned arrow into their hearts. Now, what is the effect of a poisoned arrow? There's an initial blow. Like we get hit by an arrow, we get the initial blow. But it doesn't just stop there. Other sins might have that initial effect and that's it. the poison starts to seep in and it gets worse and worse and worse. What happens? What happens is that once that image gets captured in the mind, that image that we get from watching movies which are haram, or being in situations where we should be holding our gaze but we're not, that image gets captured and shaitan is able to make use of that. Our lower nafs is able to make use of that sometime in the future. You know how Imam Ali alayhi salam says in Dua Kumail that, oh Allah, I ask you forgiveness for what happened fi khalawati min su'i fi'ali wa isaati. We recited that last night. Right? Why is it that Imam Ali mentions in particular those private times when nobody else was there? Because it's in those private times that our imagination starts to act up. And if our imagination wants to act up and start to play scenes in our mind to propel us to commit sin, what database is it going to be making use of? It's going to be making use of those images that we saw before. That's why we have so much emphasis on cutting it off from the root of the problem, which is that gaze, which is haram, because all the problems stem from there. Now there's more discussions that need to be had about this topic. Inshallah, we'll continue tomorrow. I think that we've gone on enough for tonight. I just want to recap some of the points that we talked about. We discussed how one of the signs of the end of time is that the society will be sexually crazed. The men will take their women as their qibla, and other deviances that are associated with that. We said that our society in many ways is marching towards that, and we as Muslims are not immune from that. And then we talked about how in Islam, marriage and intimate relationships between a husband and wife is something which is very pure, it's very good, it's a positive thing, it's a blessing. And it's not, doesn't have any type of lowness. In fact, it's an act of ibadah, an act of worship. But how everything has its own limits, and this has its limit as well too. And we talked about some of the deviancies that can occur, and how these are very severe in the eyes of Allah, and some of the consequences of them as well too. Inshallah, tomorrow night, if we get the tawfiq, we'll also talk about some solutions to some of the problems that sometimes people are plagued with when it comes to sexual deviancies. May Allah help us to make the most out of what remains of the month of Ramadan. May He accept all of our efforts in this month. May He help us to learn His true teachings and to be inspired to act upon them and to spread them to others. May He protect our families and our friends and all the mu'mineen. May He help all the oppressed in this world who are suffering in this month. May He help all those who are starving and hungry and cannot have even an iftar to eat while we are enjoying all the blessings that He has given to us. May He hasten the appearance of the Imam of our time. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.